Hi folks, welcome to the video lecture on Hard Times and a New Deal. I am clicking through the slides here from part one of that lecture, the part dealing with hard times. Some of the images you'll see when you look at the PowerPoint version of part one and read some of the text and study the images and such that I place here. But the video lecture deals with part two of Hard Times and a New Deal. And it begins here with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Roosevelt will be elected president in November of 1932, defeating the incumbent president Herbert Hoover in a landslide election victory in which he carries all but 3 or 4 states and wins a clear mandate, it seems, from the American people to begin implementing what he had referred to in his 1932 Democratic National Convention acceptance speech as a New Deal. It was a catchy phrase, one that had been fashioned loosely around other similar political phrases in the past. Teddy Roosevelt had offered up famously a fair deal, for example, and Franklin Roosevelt, now a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt's, follows through with his own New Deal. So we're going to pay attention to language and political style as we talk about Roosevelt's New Deal, and try to judge, if we can, its place in American history, its significance, what made it unique, why we're still talking about it these many decades later. And as we talk about Franklin Roosevelt, we're going to try to place him on the radar screen of American political history. Every so often, historians will take stock of the reputation and historical appraisal of America's presidents, and there are certain names that usually appear near the top of the list: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I think that's for a variety of reasons. Roosevelt is the only man ever elected, and likely only president ever elected to more than 2 terms. He was elected to 4 terms beginning in 1932. And so he reigned longer in the White House than any other president. But also, I think, because of the extraordinary times through which he presided, the Great Depression, of course, but then World War II defined his presidency. 2 of the great crises in American history defined his presidency. But also, I think, because of the political style that he helped establish, and much of the Roosevelt political style that we'll be talking about is introduced to the American people early on in his inaugural address of March 4, 1933. Now, I've given you a video and the actual transcript from this famous speech to study, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's one of the handful of speeches in American history that almost everyone at least would recognize by its famous, most famous phrasing, namely, the only thing we have to fear, as he put it, being fear itself. The fear itself phraseology is as famous in American history as 7 years ago, or Kennedy's "ask not what your country can do for you" phraseology. And so we define Roosevelt and his place in American history by his abilities as a communicator. And you will be looking more closely at this first inaugural address, as I say, as part of your document analysis assignment for the week. But it was more than just phraseology. From the beginning, Roosevelt and his advisors sort of struck upon a strategy to communicate to the American people in terms of how they were going to attack the problems of the Great Depression. And part one of this lecture was designed to give you a sense of just how extraordinary a problem the Great Depression really posed. I mean, to put it simply, it was the worst economic catastrophe in the history of the United States. And during the administration of Herbert Hoover, it seemed that nothing which politicians tried made any difference whatsoever in stemming the tide of the Depression. In fact, the Depression just simply got worse. And by the time Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1933, it had reached a truly crisis proportion. And, in our political culture today, there's a lot said about presidents and economic policies and taxation and financial markets. And, we're experiencing a nascent protest on our financial markets and the Occupy Wall Street movement. And time will tell if it amounts to much more than what it already is, which has been a kind of splashy item for our news media to kind of bandy about, and for supporters and opponents to line up their respective talking points. But we should never forget, no matter what kind of historical revision some may indulge in, that the Great Depression was the Great Depression, not only in name but in economic fact. And there are different ways to measure it, all of them startling even now, whether it be unemployment, which cascaded to over 30% by 1933. And just for comparison's sake, that's about 3 times what it is nationally now, 3 times percentage-wise, 3 times as many unemployed then. And most historians agree that, if anything, that number understates the true scale of the crisis, because many Americans simply given up looking for work. Tens of thousands of businesses had failed, including thousands of banks had simply gone out of business, and thus millions of depositors' accounts and savings accounts lost. The economy had actually shrunk from 1929 to 1933. So, not only was there not economic growth in those years, but the economy actually got smaller. We as a nation simply got poorer. So when he said in his address, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he was identifying a critical component of the Great Depression as it had developed by 1933, namely a psychological component, people's attitudes. Folks were down and out in their attitudes, not just in their pocketbooks. And so, to coin a contemporary phrase, and it's a bit anachronistic to use it, I think Roosevelt and his advisors decided that they either had to go big or go home. And again, I use that as a contemporary phrase that we might understand, but it captures something I think that they understood in their own terms then, that government intervention on a massive scale would be necessary, and that in effect, in order to sell the American public on this idea, an American public that has often been wary of big government solutions, and we'll say this again, there wasn't much of a tradition of big government by the time Roosevelt proposed the New Deal, that it would be necessary to treat the Depression like an emergency, and not just any emergency, but like the emergency of war, in order to rally the support of the American public. And so, with war as a metaphor, in that first inaugural speech, Roosevelt promised action, and action now. And it's ironic, of course, because Roosevelt would become a war president, in fact, during the greatest war in human history, World War II. And I imagine never thought that the use of war as a metaphor to frame the Great Depression would be, a kind of foreshadowing of a much greater actual military war a few years down the road. But in any event, what he called the New Deal, and in the beginning, remember, the New Deal was nothing much more than a political slogan. The New Deal would morph into something like government intervention on an unprecedented and massive scale. And in the war analogy, FDR himself would be the general who would lead this war on poverty. As he said, "I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems." And it begs the question then, Why was war such an effective metaphor? You know, Roosevelt's government experience included a stint as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I in the Woodrow Wilson administration. And thus he had a front row seat to what had been Woodrow Wilson's chosen strategy for rallying the American public around our war effort in the Great War. And as we saw in an earlier lecture, Wilson dramatically increased the scope of government operations in order to mobilize America on behalf of World War One. And I think that what Roosevelt was doing was going back to that Woodrow Wilson World War One playbook, in now essentially crafting and designing what would become the New Deal. And it begins very quickly. I mean, his first day in office is March 5th, 1933. And Roosevelt, the communicator, wastes little time going on to the radio, that powerful new medium, a medium so powerful it had the ability to make or break political careers. As you'll see when you look at Herbert Hoover's efforts to use the radio, it was not a technology that everyone took to, but Roosevelt did, and what becomes the first of his so-called fireside chats on March 5th was actually an address to the nation regarding the banking crisis. As I said earlier, thousands of banks had gone out of business, millions of accounts had been lost, and I think Roosevelt and his advisors knew that they would have to stem the tide of bank failures if the New Deal were to have any chance of biting into the Depression. And what historians estimate to have been an audience of some 60 million listeners, Roosevelt gave a national speech in which he explained how the administration had crafted a policy to try to save the banks from further collapse. What he called the bank holiday. It was a reassuring name, even holiday. Who doesn't like a holiday? But a bank holiday that would allow Treasury officials to inspect the accounts of individual banks, and if deeming them healthy, allowed to reopen those banks, and with a kind of governmental seal of approval. And Roosevelt was able to communicate this in confident tones in a way that I think the American people responded to. In fact, the run on the banks did stop. The first banks did reopen within 8 days of the speech, and over time the crisis would be stemmed, and the New Deal would concern itself with meaningful, banking reform laws and regulations that were designed to keep the financial sector, at least the banking part of it, from falling into collapse. And it's a lesson that ultimately I think we as a nation forgot, because by the 1990s we were stripping away many of those New Deal era laws, and as we know, found ourselves in the last few years back right in the same situation that the American public faced in 1933. So much for not repeating the mistakes of the past. But it was just the beginning for the New Deal, because Roosevelt pushed forward now with a plethora of governmental agencies and relief laws and such. In fact, regulation relief, as I have here at the bottom of the slide, were the two main goals of the New Deal, and some 15 major bills passed by Congress. One recalls how difficult it was for the Obama administration to get through a single health care law, admittedly a thorny and conflict-studded issue, health care. One, by the way, parenthetically, that FDR was not able to accomplish during the New Deal. But nevertheless, the difficulty that the Obama administration had in passing, and which countless administrations have had in trying to get their pet legislation through Congress, Roosevelt did more than he was able to get 15 major bills passed in just 100 days. The historian Richard Hofstadter called our Constitution a harmonious system of mutual frustration. And it was designed by the founding fathers to make legislation a difficult enterprise. They feared that too much bad legislation would be passed. But Roosevelt was able to somehow leverage 15 major bills through Congress, using the analogy of war. The emergency of war, I think, was critical here. That Congress didn't wish to be seen as somehow, restricting or blocking, what now seemed to be the last best hope to somehow deal with this depression. And don't forget what was on the other side of failure. In Nazi Germany, at the same time, Hitler was consolidating power, having dissolved the German parliament, suspended all democratic processes, essentially taken over the country with an iron grip and leading it to a radical transformation and ultimately war. And so when Roosevelt talked about fear, he knew the potential for collapse and trust in government to simply disappear, and the danger of that. So Congress understood it too, and thus there was a great deal of support, I think, for Roosevelt's programs. The so-called alphabet soup agencies, so many of them created government agencies, again based loosely on the World War I model, where World War I had its Food Services Administration, its War Industries Board, its Committee on Public Information. The New Deal will have its own versions of those things, like the National Recovery Administration, which issued so-called codes of fair competition to try to restore competitiveness and viability to American business. As important as some of the policies of the NRA was just its promotion, Blue Eagle seal, the red, white, and blue letters and imagery, all sort of suggesting a patriotic, almost war poster approach to the problem of the Great Depression. Even the pithy slogan, "We do our part," made it a propaganda model based on the World War I model. And propaganda and persuasion were critical to Roosevelt's New Deal from the very beginning. Again, learning from World War I that if you could find sympathetic celebrities to help tout the programs, that the public would be more willing to somehow trust them. Charlie Chaplin, the Hollywood actor, here giving a speech on radio broadcast on behalf of the NRA. This particular picture shows New York's Mayor LaGuardia and various dignitaries ready to hoist the NRA Blue Eagle flag as if it were a patriotic flag-raising ceremony. We also know that in our advertising-saturated society that if you can't sell a product with any other device, then put some sex appeal into it. And so we have here an NRA poster showing some bathing beauties with the Blue Eagle emblazoned on their back, and from the backs of bathing beauties to storefront windows like this restaurant here, where passers-by could see that the NRA was in support. It almost suggested that somehow if you didn't get with the program, you weren't doing your part, and therefore were somehow less than patriotic. And a great deal of the fanfare that attended the early New Deal programs were very much designed to create that kind of wartime patriotic appeal. In addition to propaganda, of course, there were the programs themselves, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, that sought to provide price supports and subsidies for America's farmers to stem the collapse of farm income, basically promising farmers government subsidies to supplement their market incomes. Factory workers were now targeted as well. It wasn't just the factory owners, but factory workers, with the first minimum wage law, for example, in American history, promising a basic guaranteed minimum, if nothing else, to supplement the meager, incomes of working people. The right to collective bargaining with workers' unions and employers. I mean, these are the kinds of things that the New Deal now early on is looking to in order to bolster its its credibility with the public, but also to try and provide some kind of material assistance to recovery. In some cases, relief, pure and simple. Eleanor Roosevelt, who you're reading about in Chapter 9, will be writing on the next exam an essay concerning Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the president, of course, who Franklin called my eyes and ears, due to her ability to move freely about the country, and because of her own, enormous concern and interest in the problems of Americans, Eleanor Roosevelt becomes an important part of the New Deal. Here she is in Scotts Run, West Virginia, an impoverished mining community in Appalachia, whose families had just been put out by the collapse of the mining economy, and who were already living in almost primitive conditions. Eleanor Roosevelt helped spearhead a movement to create subsistence housing in Scotts Run and creating new communities, a new community, Arthurdale, and built entirely on federal subsidies with new housing, indoor plumbing, electricity, something that many of these families had never experienced. All in all, the first 100 days took the country by storm. These alphabet soup agencies and Roosevelt's own ceaseless energy. In fact, it's telling here, this cartoon that shows Roosevelt striding ahead of this character, Congress, who's sweating bullets just trying to keep up with the president, an armful of Roosevelt policies. The caption, "Doesn't Frank ever feel like resting a little?" Just minding his business and going along. And it's all the more remarkable because you may know about Franklin Roosevelt is that he had suffered a near lethal bout with polio in the early 1920s when he was still only about 38, 39 years old. Roosevelt contracted poliomyelitis, one of the killing, crippling diseases of the early 20th century. He survived it, of course, but he was left crippled the rest of his life, actually paralyzed from the waist down. He would never walk under his own power. Again, he learned how to walk. He learned how to what appeared to walk, a kind of imitation of walking for short distances with heavy leg braces and a cane and the support of someone that he could hold on to. He did that at his inaugural address. You'll notice when you watch the speech, he appeared to be walking to the speaker's platform. And I don't think the majority of the American people really understood that here was a man who had been left paralyzed by polio, because his active demeanor, his energy, even to the cartoonist here, had him seemingly able-bodied and striding. Not everything Roosevelt did in those early years, of course, was popular or even effective. His attempts to get around a thorny problem with the Supreme Court proved to be unpopular. Much of the early New Deal, including the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the NRA, were declared unconstitutional by a Supreme Court that was composed mostly of prior appointees under Republican presidents, men who were conservative and who felt the New Deal really went beyond the boundaries of presidential constitutional authority. Roosevelt responded by announcing what the media called a court-packing scheme. He said for each Justice 70 or over who refused to retire, remember Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, but for every member 70 over who refused to retire, that he, the president, would nominate and appoint an additional justice to the court. And it's true, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the court has to be composed of 9 members by tradition. And for most of its career, the Supreme Court has been composed of 9 members. But Roosevelt calculated that he'd win public support for this scheme, and yet he didn't. The public at large, even Roosevelt supporters, thought it was heavy-handed and played into the charges of his opponents that Roosevelt was interested in being a tyrant or a dictator. So he eventually abandoned his court-packing scheme, and Mother Nature really accomplished what he couldn't, because some of these elderly jurists retired or died in the next few years, and he was able to appoint through traditional processes more sympathetic members who then took a better view of certain New Deal policies. But the Depression dragged on. For all the work of the 100 days and all the innovative agencies and federal relief programs and such, the truth is that the Great Depression dragged on, and especially troubling was the nagging, crippling problem of unemployment. Roosevelt will, in 1935, announce, therefore, a second New Deal, and he was going to have to run for re-election the next year, and he knew he'd have to answer to the voters who expected him to somehow end this terrible depression. So he wasn't willing to take his chances or rest on his laurels, because the fact is the Depression was still around. In fact, it in some ways had intensified where problems like unemployment were concerned. So Roosevelt followed upon some of the early initiatives of Herbert Hoover in announcing unemployment relief, and in particular creating public works programs. These are government works programs that would create jobs in the public sector, infrastructure, internal improvements, and such that would put Americans to work, like the Works Progress Administration, which was one of three such public works administrations. The WPA, as it was known, would ultimately enroll millions and millions of Americans in government-funded work projects, everything from laying sewer pipes to paving roads to building public buildings, including schools. You can still find in the Sacramento area some of the older school auditoriums and such with the familiar little copper plaques that say "Built by the Works Progress Administration." They even took pity on unemployed historians and artists and gave them work in creating public artistic murals and doing public history projects. So really no one was overlooked, it seems. And it proved to be popular. I mean, critics said it was make work, but anybody who had been hired after being unemployed was thrilled to have the opportunity. Other progressive programs, most famously Social Security. Here's FDR signing in 1935 the Social Security Act, which was, again, a relief measure aimed at helping certain particularly vulnerable constituencies. One, obviously, the elderly, by providing for now a kind of mandatory retirement age and a forced savings program taken right out of the payroll, a kind of payroll tax that would provide for benefits in retirement. We know that today there's a great deal of debate and concern over Social Security and its viability, in the coming decades. But at the time, it was really seen as an effort to help those who, through no fault of their own, were suddenly the most vulnerable, and not only elderly people, but also dependent children of single-parent homes and that sort of thing. Providing benefits for dependent children of single-parent homes, again seen as a kind of necessary and beneficial way of distributing public monies to provide a kind of safety net, really, and catch those who might fall through. And one of the things the New Deal does, it requires that America reappraise its own attitudes toward poverty, because there was this idea, after all, in American history that here was the land of opportunity, the best poor man's country, America, and that anyone in America who was out of work or down and out, impoverished, there was something wrong with them, that they were lazy, they suffered from character defects. Well, that sort of fantasy, wasn't something you could really indulge in any longer, because in a modern industrial society, something like unemployment was the product of, large impersonal economic forces, and to be laid off did not reflect one's willingness or ability to work. It simply reflected the vagaries of supply and demand and cost cutting and income protecting interests of businesses. And so here was an effort now by the administration to say, in fact, it really is our obligation as a modern nation to provide for those who are the most vulnerable, providing some kind of relief for those who are most vulnerable. And yet, despite, again, these efforts, and Roosevelt will be reelected in 1936, by the end of the 1930s, in some ways, the New Deal was running out of steam. I mean, all these efforts have been tried, agencies created, and yet the Depression still dragged on. And as he approached 1940 and signaled a willingness to run for a third term, it really brought his critics out in full force. His critics among big business leaders and others, in particular, who saw New Deal agencies as somehow a threat to their own private initiatives and the traditional openness of the marketplace and that kind of thing. So much so that critics were taking aim at King Roosevelt, by 1939, 1940. This editorial cartoon shows Roosevelt apparently having a good time chatting up what appears to be his good friend Joseph Stalin, the communist tyrant dictator of the Soviet Union. You see, Stalin has ripped up the Constitution of the USSR and has torn out a piece with freedom on it. Roosevelt seemingly laughing it up, saying, I'm glad you dug up your Constitution, Joe. I can't find ours. So, again, a not atypical, kind of political back and forth here now between Republicans and Democrats and supporters and opponents of Roosevelt. But the Roosevelt and the New Deal certainly had changed American politics. They may not have created the answer to the Great Depression. And by the way, historians still debate whether or not the New Deal policies helped or hindered America's recovery. I think the most mature judgment actually is that if not curing the Great Depression, the New Deal policy somehow stemmed the tide of the Depression, kept it from getting worse. The fact is we don't become Nazi Germany. We don't become the Soviet Union. Capitalism does survive. Although it will be World War II that really ultimately provides the economic stimulus to a recovered economy. But despite that, the Roosevelts and the New Deal had certainly changed American politics. Eleanor Roosevelt, as you'll be reading, was simply without precedent and really without equal still as a first lady who created a public profile for herself, who became a kind of political force in her own right. And certainly FDR's command of the media, his ability to communicate the vision of the New Deal to common ordinary Americans, made him a political giant. I mean, if you had been born in 1920, you would have been about 12 years old when Roosevelt was elected. By the time he dies in 1945, you would have been 25 years old, and so half your life would have been spent, in the orbit of this political giant, Franklin Roosevelt. His style, his articulate quality, his boundless enthusiasm and buoyancy, his skillful, shrewd use of the media, and his willingness to embrace innovative programs. Roosevelt was no communist, no socialist, no revolutionary. He was a basically conservative, sort of fiscally conservative Democrat who believed in the idea now that government had a critical role to play in somehow supporting a failing capitalist economy. This was a critical decision to be made, and Roosevelt made it unhesitatingly because I think ultimately he was trying to save capitalism, not destroy it, as some revisionists and other critics would suggest. But what we know is that whether or not the Great Depression was cured or the New Deal succeeded, a new crisis was about to change America and the world. And that new crisis, of course, sparked by the attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941, was America's entry into World War II. And so we'll follow America into the war as we move into next week. But for now, and that will be sort of part two of Roosevelt's presidency. But for now, let me make one other point about Roosevelt's influence on the American political process. Roosevelt was able to win all those elections, 4 terms in office, because he created a political coalition, sometimes called the New Deal coalition, of voters that could sustain a majority in both in Congress and in his presidential elections. And it was a strange coalition in some ways. It was white Southern Democrats, a solid white supremacist Jim Crow Democratic constituency of the South, which supported Roosevelt simply because he was a Democrat, but also because of his and Eleanor's ability to bring in disparate voices in the North, from women voters, minority voters, organized labor. So he created a powerful coalition that would see him through all those election victories and cement, his name, as I say earlier, as one of the great figures of American political history. All right, well, that's it for now. You have other things you'll be doing this week, but we'll continue the story of the Roosevelt years in some of the lectures to come.